Hollywood may look like a glittering dream machine, but behind the bright lights sat a group of powerful bosses who called every shot. These were the men who didn't just run the studios. They practically owned the stars, the stories, and even the scandals. How far would they go to protect their empire? And what hidden moves shaped the golden age you thought you knew? Let's open the vault and uncover 12 secrets that prove the industry was never really free. Louis B. Mayer. Louis B. Mayer wasn't just the head of MGM. He was the undisputed emperor of old Hollywood. To many, he looked like a kindly studio chief who loved family values. But in reality, Mayer treated his actors like property, written into ironclad contracts. If a star wanted to rise in MGM, Mayer decided the terms, the roles, and even the details of their personal lives. What made his contracts infamous was the so-called morality clause. This gave Mayer the power to punish or fire actors if they were caught in scandals or behaved in ways he didn't approve of. That meant Mayer and his team could demand that stars attend publicity events, go on stage dates with co-stars, or even hide relationships that didn't fit the studio's polished image. For example, when Judy Garland struggled under the pressures of fame, Mayer's system didn't slow down to help her. It doubled the pressure, pushing her through endless shoots with little rest. Mayer also employed fixers, trusted men who could erase scandals before the press got them. That meant paying off reporters, silencing witnesses, or arranging cover stories to keep the MGM brand untouchable. Mayer understood something simple. If audiences saw the stars as flawless, the box office stayed strong. Behind the curtain, Mayer's contracts turned the dream factory into a kind of cage. Many stars felt trapped, but they had no choice. MGM was too big to fight. Mayer's iron grip shaped not just careers, but the very culture of Hollywood itself, proving that the magic on screen came at a heavy price. Harry Cohn. If Louis B. Mayer ruled by contracts, Harry Cohn ruled by fear. As the head of Columbia Pictures, Cohn became known as one of the most dreaded figures in Hollywood. His employees had a nickname for him, King Cohn. And it wasn't meant as a compliment. Cohn believed the only way to keep control was to terrify everyone beneath him. Cohn's office was perched on the top floor of Columbia's studio building, and actors joked that just walking past his door was enough to make their stomachs twist. He was notorious for shouting fits, insults, and humiliating put-downs aimed at stars, directors, and executives alike. What made it worse was that Cohn could also be vindictive. If an actor crossed him or refused a role, he could blacklist them from Columbia and spread word to other studios, ending a career overnight. But here's the contradiction. Cohn's tough methods worked. Under his watch, Columbia went from a small, struggling outfit into a serious player in Hollywood. He had an eye for talent, bringing in stars like Rita Hayworth and directors like Frank Capra, whose film, It Happened One Night, swept the Oscars in 1934. Yet even Capra, who owed his biggest success to Columbia, admitted that working with Cohn was like living under a storm cloud. Behind the scenes, Cohn's intimidation extended beyond the studio gates. He kept files on employees, hired private investigators to track gossip, and made sure no one forgot who held the real power. Some actors claimed that even when they weren't on the lot, they felt Cohn's presence like a shadow. Harry Cohn's reign proved that fear could be just as strong a tool as charm in shaping Hollywood's golden age. His legacy is a reminder that the movies you loved were often born out of an atmosphere of dread. The Warner Brothers. The Warner Brothers, Harry, Albert, Sam, and Jack, weren't just pioneers of talking pictures. They were also ruthless businessmen who would crush anyone who threatened their control. Jack Warner, the most infamous of the four, ran the studio like a battlefield. He believed unions were dangerous, and when actors or crew demanded better pay or conditions, he fought back with every trick in the book. During the 1930s and 40s, when Hollywood workers began organizing, Warner used spies to monitor employees and root out union leaders. If someone spoke up at a meeting, Warner often knew about it the very next day. He hired private detectives to infiltrate labor groups, and in some cases, stars who dared protest found themselves mysteriously without work. Even directors and writers weren't safe. The most famous showdown came in 1945, when the Conference of Studio Unions launched a massive strike against Warner Brothers. The picket lines outside the Burbank studio exploded into violence, with police clashing against strikers. The strike lasted months, and while the union eventually collapsed, Warner proved he would do whatever it took to protect his empire. Jack Warner wasn't only tough on labor, he was tough on family. He double-crossed his own brothers, maneuvering them out of company shares in a backroom deal that left him sole ruler of the studio. His betrayal was so complete that Harry Warner never forgave him. The Warner brothers built one of the strongest studios of the Golden Age, but the price was constant warfare, both inside and outside their gates. For Jack Warner, control was everything, and he would happily burn bridges, or even whole unions, just to keep his grip tight. Samuel Goldwyn. Samuel Goldwyn had a reputation for being eccentric, brilliant, and at times impossible. But what truly made his name in Hollywood was his vision of glamour. Goldwyn carefully crafted the idea of the Goldwyn Girl, a chorus line of beautiful young women featured in his pictures during the 1920s and 30s. On screen, they looked like dazzling symbols of Hollywood magic. Off screen, the truth was far more complicated. The Goldwyn girls were handpicked for their looks, charm, and screen presence. Many went on to stardom. Betty Grable, Lucille Ball, and Paulette Goddard all started as Goldwyn girls. But the system was less about nurturing talent and more about control. Goldwyn's staff managed their diets, wardrobes, and publicity appearances, grooming them into the image the studio wanted. Life for these women wasn't glamorous. The studio demanded constant perfection, and any slip in weight or appearance could mean dismissal. Goldwyn believed the Goldwyn girls were the perfect marketing tool. Audiences loved seeing them, and gossip columnists were fed stories to keep their names in the papers. There were also rumors that Goldwyn used the troupe as a way to keep executives and producers entertained at private gatherings. While the press celebrated them as Hollywood royalty, many of the young women felt like they were trapped in a spotlight they couldn't escape. Still, the Goldwyn girls left a mark on Hollywood's identity. They shaped the classic idea of the chorus line beauty, shimmering in sequins, smiling perfectly for the camera. Yet their story also shows how the Golden Age built its dreams on carefully managed illusions, and how much control was hidden behind those sparkling lights. Barney Balaban. Barney Balaban may not be a household name today, but during Hollywood's golden years, he was the quiet, steady hand guiding Paramount Pictures. Rising from a family that once ran small Nickelodeon theaters in Chicago, Balaban climbed to the very top, serving as Paramount's president from the 1930s through the 1960s. Unlike the flamboyant figures at MGM or Warner Brothers, Balaban preferred to work from the shadows, but his control over the studio was absolute. Balaban's reign was built on discipline and silence. He avoided scandal by keeping a tight leash on publicity and demanding that Paramount stars toe the line. While other moguls were known for explosive tempers or headline-grabbing antics, Balaban was calm, calculating, and relentless. If a star's reputation wobbled, Paramount's publicity machine stepped in to smooth it out. Reporters were bribed, rumors suppressed, and damaging stories quietly buried. His philosophy was simple. Paramount's image came first, and no star, no matter how big, could risk it. He also mastered the art of managing relationships with Washington power brokers. During World War II, Balaban ensured Paramount worked hand-in-hand with government agencies, supplying films that boosted morale and patriotism. This won him both influence and protection at a time when Hollywood faced constant scrutiny. Balaban wasn't flashy like Louis B. Mayer or terrifying like Harry Cohn, But his steady grip shaped Paramount into one of the strongest and most profitable studios of the Golden Era. By staying quiet and keeping controversies under wraps, he proved that control didn't always need shouting. It could be exercised with cold, calculated silence. Carl Laemmle, Universal's founder. Carl Laemmle had a simple rule when it came to hiring: family first. The studio became so filled with his relatives that Hollywood insiders jokingly called it Laemmle's family. At one point, Laemmle had nearly 70 family members on the payroll, from executives to assistants, creating what might have been the largest nepotism empire in the industry. Laemmle was a German immigrant who loved movies and took risks long before Hollywood became glamorous. He built Universal into a powerhouse, famous for its horror films like Dracula and Frankenstein. But behind the success, Laemmle's habit of putting relatives in key roles shaped the company in unusual ways. Some of his hires had talent, others didn't, but all of them were loyal. The nepotism wasn't a secret. Reporters joked about it openly. Actors and directors who worked at Universal often rolled their eyes at the constant presence of Uncle Carl's extended family, who seemed to appear in every department. Yet Laemmle defended his approach, saying he trusted family more than outsiders. Still, this family-first philosophy had consequences. By the 1930s, Universal was struggling financially, and some critics blamed Laemmle's management style. He eventually lost control of the studio after backing an expensive production, Showboat. His relatives were swept out along with him. Carl Laemmle's legacy is complicated. On one hand, he was a pioneer who helped shape the foundation of Hollywood. On the other, his studio became a punchline for nepotism. The story of Universal under Laemmle proves that Hollywood wasn't just about glamour, it was also about power kept close, sometimes too close. Eddie Mannix and Howard Strickling. If Hollywood stars were the shining jewels of MGM, Eddie Mannix and Howard Strickling were the men polishing those jewels in the dark. Mannix, the studio's tough general manager, and Strickling, its head of publicity, worked as the legendary fixers of old Hollywood. Their job wasn't to make movies. It was to erase problems before the world saw them. Mannix was a former brawler with mob ties who thought nothing of using muscle to protect the studio's image. Strickling, on the other hand, was smooth and persuasive, a master of spinning stories for the press. Together, they formed an unstoppable team. If a star got into a car accident, Mannix made the wreck disappear. If an affair threatened a marriage, Strickling handed columnists a different headline. Even pregnancies that didn't fit studio plans were covered with illnesses or emergency surgeries. One of their most famous interventions involved Clark Gable, MGM's biggest male star. When gossip swirled about his off-screen romances, Mannix and Strickling planted stories of heroic hunting trips and wholesome charity work. Reporters happily played along, knowing MGM's favors would pay off with future scoops. Their work wasn't clean. Rumors followed Mannix about mysterious payouts and even cover-ups of violent crimes. Strickling's charm could silence journalists, but it often came with threats hiding beneath the smile. Together, they made sure MGM's family-friendly image survived, no matter what chaos roared behind the gates. The fixers were proof that Hollywood's golden glow wasn't natural, it was manufactured. While audiences swooned over perfect stars, Mannix and Strickling were backstage, stitching together illusions and burying the kind of scandals that could have destroyed careers overnight. Harry Warner, one of the famous Warner brothers, wasn't just building a studio. He was helping build the very idea of what Hollywood looked like. While his brother Jack became infamous for fighting labor battles and double-crossing rivals, Harry turned his attention to the public face of the industry. He understood better than almost anyone that the star system wasn't just about talent. It was about image, and that image could be manufactured from scratch. Under Harry Warner's guidance, the studio press departments worked like factories, crafting biographies that often had little to do with reality. Ordinary names were stripped away and replaced with glamorous ones. Backgrounds were rewritten until they gleamed with fantasy. A small-town girl could be transformed into a cosmopolitan beauty, while a young man with an accent might suddenly become an all-American hero after a few months of training and a name change. Some of Hollywood's brightest icons were created under this system. Stars who started with humble or difficult beginnings were refashioned into perfect figures for audiences to admire. Every detail, from hairline adjustments to staged romances, was part of Harry Warner's strategy to keep fans hooked. The approach worked brilliantly at the box office. Audiences believed the dream and flocked to theaters in droves. But for the actors themselves, it often meant living double lives, constantly maintaining a persona that wasn't really their own. Many later admitted they struggled to reconcile the studio-created version of themselves with who they truly were. Harry Warner's legacy reminds us that the Dream Factory wasn't just about making movies. It was about carefully shaping people into illusions, selling those illusions to the world, and guarding them with relentless control. Adolph Zukor. If you think modern Hollywood is dominated by a few big studios, you should look back at Adolph Zukor, the founder of Paramount Pictures. Zukor practically invented the idea of studio monopoly. His weapon? A system called block booking. Here's how it worked. Theaters that wanted one of Paramount's big hits also had to buy a whole slate of less desirable films. It was an all-or-nothing deal. If you wanted the next star-packed spectacle, you had to screen every smaller picture too. This forced independent theaters into contracts that heavily favored Paramount and squeezed out competitors. Block booking gave Paramount enormous control. By the 1920s, Zukor had built a studio empire that stretched from production to distribution to exhibition. He owned not just the films, but also the theaters that showed them. Paramount could dictate what audiences saw, and rival producers found themselves locked out of screens. The strategy was so powerful that it eventually drew the attention of the U.S. government. Decades later, the 1948 Paramount Decree would force studios to separate from their theater chains, breaking the monopoly Zukor had pioneered. But by then, Paramount had already shaped Hollywood's golden years with its dominance. Zukor's rise shows how the Moguls weren't just storytellers. They were businessmen playing chess with entire industries. He turned Paramount into a machine that didn't just make movies. It controlled what America watched, when they watched it, and where. David O. Selznick. David O. Selznick was the producer who delivered Gone with the Wind, one of the most famous films ever made. But behind the triumph was a man consumed by obsession, pushing everyone around him to the edge. Selznick believed no detail was too small to perfect, and his perfectionism became a nightmare for cast and crew. When Gone with the Wind was in production, Selznick famously burned through directors. He hired George Cukor, then fired him. He brought in Victor Fleming, who soon collapsed from exhaustion. Then, he quietly leaned on Sam Wood to step in when Fleming needed a break. All the while, Selznick lurked on set, rewriting dialogue, reshuffling scenes, and demanding endless reshoots. His constant interference drove actors crazy. Clark Gable threatened to walk more than once, and Vivien Leigh wrote to friends about the madness that ruled the set. Selznick's obsession didn't stop with directing. He micromanaged costumes, lighting, even background extras, refusing to compromise. He consumed Benzedrine tablets to stay awake during marathon editing sessions, working around the clock until his nerves were fried. By the time the film premiered, Selznick was a wreck, but he had his prize. A record-breaking masterpiece that won 10 Academy Awards. The irony? Selznick's relentless drive almost destroyed the very film it produced. He proved that Hollywood legends often came from torment as much as brilliance. Selznick's obsession turned Gone with the Wind into history, but it also showed how far a mogul would go to control not just a film, but everyone tied to it. William Fox. William Fox was a pioneer who helped give the world movie palaces and the Fox Film Corporation. But his story didn't end with glory. It ended with one of the most dramatic downfalls in Hollywood history. Fox rose from nothing, building his company into a major force by backing stars like Theda Bara and investing heavily in theaters. He was among the first to push for sound technology, seeing its potential before others dared. At his peak, Fox controlled more than 1,000 theaters and stood shoulder to shoulder with giants like Paramount and MGM. But power in Hollywood was always fragile. In the late 1920s, Fox borrowed heavily to expand his empire, just as the stock market was about to collapse. The Wall Street crash of 1929 crushed him. To make matters worse, he was injured in a car accident during the critical period, leaving him unable to defend his company as rivals circled. By 1930, Fox was forced out of his own studio. He fought bitter legal battles, but the empire he built slipped from his hands. Years later, he faced charges of bribery and even spent time in prison. From kingmaker to forgotten exile, Fox's career was a lesson in how quickly fortunes could vanish in Hollywood's cutthroat world. His name lives on in 20th Century Fox, but William Fox himself faded into obscurity. His fall reminds us that in old Hollywood, no mogul was untouchable, and power could vanish in a blink. Nicholas Schenck. While names like Mayer and Warner often dominate old Hollywood history, one of the most powerful men in the business operated almost entirely out of sight. Nicholas Schenck, the head of Loew's Inc., the parent company of MGM, wasn't a flashy producer or a star maker. He was the corporate boss who quietly controlled the purse strings, and by extension, the entire industry. Schenck began as a theater operator in New York before rising to oversee Loew's nationwide theater chain. That position gave him something no Hollywood producer could match: the ability to decide what millions of Americans actually saw on their screens. Every major studio head, even titans like Louis B. Mayer, ultimately had to answer to him. Behind closed doors, Mayer himself admitted he hated Schenck, but couldn't defy him. Schenck's greatest power play came during the 1920s and 30s, when Loew's expansion turned MGM into the jewel of Hollywood. He controlled budgets, greenlit projects, and could shut down productions with a single phone call. Stars who thought they were at the top of the food chain discovered quickly that Mayer wasn't their final boss. Schenck was. His methods were ruthless. He demanded absolute loyalty, cut costs to the bone, and never hesitated to sacrifice even popular projects if profits didn't align. Though rarely in the spotlight, his business decisions shaped what audiences saw for decades. Ironically, his secrecy also meant he faded into the shadows of history, remembered only by insiders who knew how much authority he wielded. Schenck's story reveals a final, chilling truth about old Hollywood. The real moguls weren't always the ones on magazine covers. Sometimes the man with the most control was the one whose name the public barely knew. So there you have it, 12 secrets that reveal how old Hollywood wasn't just a dream factory, it was a kingdom, ruled by iron-fisted moguls who controlled every frame, every contract, and every illusion. Which of these power plays shocked you most? And do you think the industry today is really that different? Drop your thoughts in the comments, hit that subscribe button, and share this with anyone who still believes old Hollywood was all glamour. The truth, as always, is a lot darker.